hard to start after a good joke. I was thinking of one I could tell you, but I'm afraid that it's a little off color, so I have to be emboldened. I'm here partly symbolically to indicate just how important this subject is to IFAD. We have actually announced that scaling up is mission critical to IFAD. If we do not succeed on this journey from being essentially a boutique IFI providing what we hope are innovative projects in agriculture and rural development to developing countries to an impetus for scaling up, we will not have succeeded. So we have bought into this, not just the president and myself, but I think the majority of the staff, not all, and I'm going to get to that issue in a second. Let me also thank IFPRI and Johannes and the Brookings Institution for pushing this so hard. Johannes has been at this in IFAD for about 3 years, as he says, and he has been probably the single most important element in making this happen. For those of you who don't know IFAD, this is not an advertisement for IFAD. I am going to share with you some of the issues that we have confronting us in making this transition. We are an IFI. It's a very interesting IFI in that we're the only international financial institution that is a UN specialized agency. Think of this as a vertical fund, providing loans and grants to developing countries for agriculture and rural development. And to give you an idea of the size, this year we will be lending and granting about $1 billion. We operate currently in 93 countries. We have a portfolio of about $4.5 billion, so it's not so small. But it's not large enough to scale up by ourselves. So part of this journey is exactly the partnership point that Johannes made, and that is how to be an impetus rather than a financier of scaled up agriculture and rural development programs. Now, I have produced an article in this book, and I've been told not to repeat it, so I'm not going to. What I'm going to do is to share with you some of the institutional conundrums, problems and issues that we face in actually making this happen. What we found, and what Brookings found when they looked at us from head to toe, is that in fact in IFAD's history there are some projects that were scaled up. So we do scale up sometimes, mostly for reasons of serendipity, to tell you the truth. There wasn't a plan. There were some good people, as our friend from Aga Khan said, who were involved in these things, and a set of circumstances that fit pretty nicely with the Brookings model. Policies, circumstances, funding available at the time, for example, the Peru case study, which you will find in the book. But these cases are too few. In many cases, what we found is that there were scalable projects. Some of these boutiques, these small-scale projects were scalable, and they weren't scaled up, which is kind of disturbing. There was no effort to do anything about this. And of course, there were many projects that were neither scalable nor particularly worthwhile. So that may have been a good story. They weren't scaled up, thank goodness, but we had those as well. So it's really in that category. What was intriguing to me was the category of projects that looked to be scalable, that could have a significant impact on a lot of people that were not scaled up. Now, the few that were scaled up, that's interesting too, to see what transpired, but it's really in that second category. One of the things to do in looking at this is to look at what other institutions do. And of course, this book is very useful in looking at this. But what you will find is that most of the aid institutions in this business look a bit like IFAD. They have lots of projects that either should not have been scaled up, they actually failed, or maybe they were good but weren't scaled up in very few cases. This is the sad thing about it. In fact, the topography here of the aid business in agriculture is a very unpleasant one to have to admit to. I liken it to, if you have any connection with Latin America and Latin American cemeteries, they tend to bury people above ground in stories. My wife is Peruvian, and her father is in one of these things, and I think he's at the 15th level. I can't even see it when we go and visit his grave in Lima. Well, that's what the agricultural aid business is, ladies and gentlemen. In many countries, it's projects that are built one on top of the next, with very little reckoning of the projects that are down below. And those of you who are old enough, and I see in this audience there are several of you that meet that, may remember visiting projects that they were involved with 20 years ago and seeing somebody else's project with no recognition that there was anything there before. So we have a problem. We have a serious problem. And we wasted a lot of money, of both our own and of governments. So we need to do something about this. One of the things I will say from the article that I did a bit of research for this book is that if you look at the countries that have succeeded best in agricultural growth, just look at their agricultural growth figures, you will see very quickly, if you look at the list of them, they're the countries that have devoted the larger proportion of their public expenditure programs to agriculture, so they put their own money in. Intuitively, they're the countries that have had better agricultural policy. It's very hard to find any country in the world that has really good agricultural policy, but they tend to be better. And they've tended to tell the donors what they want to do, the Chinas and the Brazils of this world, rather than letting the donors run around doing their hundreds of little cemetery-style projects. So there is some empirical evidence, I think, and this is what I put in this article, that scaled-up programs, scaled-up projects with governments in the driver's seat, provided that there's good agricultural policy, not great, doesn't have to be great, that you tend to get better results, and that can be measured in terms of agricultural growth. It can also be measured in terms of rural poverty reduction, because it also has statistics on this. Anyway, take a look at this. Let's get back to IFAD. What have we been doing since we have learned these things, which I've summarized very quickly from Brookings and from looking at ourselves? Well, the first thing that we did was to disseminate this information. And I have brought together IFAD staff, a lot of interest. We've listened to Johannes several times and his team and others who have come to present this. And what is the first reaction from the staff? These are pretty good staff in IFAD, I think, as good as you will find anywhere. The first reaction is, we do this already. It's denial. It's a little bit like an alcoholic. If you've dealt with alcoholics, it's denial. We do this already. We already do the scaling up. And as you start to probe them, you realize that there is a terrible misunderstanding, that they don't actually understand what the scaling up was. You remember, Johannes, when you first came, you had a wall of denial. We're already involved in this business. We do this perfectly fine, and we certainly don't need the Brookings Institution to tell us where we're going wrong. So the first thing I think to do in an institution is to overcome that resistance. And my bet is that many of the aid institutions are in the same boat. They're still actually at that first stage. They're still in denial. They think that they're doing it just fine. Thank you very much. And they're not. If you look at the evidence, for the most part. They'll have good cases, but they're too few. Second thing that we found is that in our country-level dialogue, we spend a lot of time talking with governments, beginning with something that we call a strategy, country strategy, that defines what we do in the future, that we have almost no discussion of scaling up. All of our discussion is about, or most of our discussion is about the future projects, and maybe the issues that we're confronting in the existing projects. And we have a lot of issues. Corruption issues and procurement issues, so you can actually legitimately spend all of your time talking about this. But the problem is you have to, at the beginning, begin to plan scaling up even before you have something to scale up. Because if you don't do that, if you don't have that thought process, that pathway, which will involve policies, it will involve markets, it'll involve how you actually design these projects, it's very unlikely, or at least the probability of having something that is scaled up is reduced. So one of the practical things that we have tried to do, and with very mixed success, I have to tell you, is to get the principal staff that deal with governments to begin right at the beginning in the country strategy with the scaling up dialogue. And again, Johannes saw this very early on. One of his recommendations to me was, don't think of this as something that starts at project design. Think of it as something that starts in your country program dialogue, even before the projects are identified. And that gets me to the third one, which is the staff incentives. So what are the incentives of staff to talk about this in design of projects, obviously, design of programs, sticking with it in the long term? What are these incentive effects? What are the signals being provided to staff? And here, to be honest with you, I see this as our major constraint at this point. Because once you overcome the denial, you have to empower and tool up staff to think differently about programs, to think of them in the long term. Well, long term? Probably an IFAD staff member stays with a country about as long as an Aga Khan staff member does, 4 to 5 years. So they don't have, the long term is the next guy. The scaling up project is going to be for somebody, it's not even the person who replaces him or her, it's the next. Their incentives are to look at the specific project that they are working on. Their incentives are relatively short term, 4 years. That's a very tough one to overcome. What is an incentive in a bureaucracy, incidentally? You don't pay them more money to think long term. In IFAD, since we're a UN bureaucracy, our personnel evaluation system is absolutely atrocious. You don't even promote them more or fire them if they don't. So that the typical tools of incentives that one would talk about in the private sector don't exist. It has to be something that they believe, is my conclusion. And this is why we spent so much time on seminars, talking about it, giving prizes to the few staff awards, which incidentally is just a little piece of paper signed by the president of IFAD for the projects that have been scaled up. So the incentive system is a big constraint, and it's probably in IFAD at least, the most important thing for us to overcome, because once that's overcome, then you can begin the training programs, which you've already begun, to give them the tools, the staff the tools, to enable them to start thinking and planning for scale up. Knowledge. Since our sector, unfortunately, is so bereft of examples of good scaling up, somebody's got a scaled up phone over there. We should hire you to show. It's, one of the problems is that it's very difficult to find the lessons in the world. Think about this country, those of you who follow American foreign policy. This is not a particularly good model to show to anyone. I live in Europe, in Rome, and I can tell you that the European Union's foreign policy isn't a lot better. I would suggest it's a little bit better, but it's from really terrible to simply bad. So we have a problem. Once we get the motivation and the incentives going, and some framework for thinking about it, is that in terms of agriculture itself, the policy and investment environment, we don't have a lot of good examples out there. I suspect that it was actually hard to find, I never asked Johannes this, but hard to find a lot of good examples of successful scaled up programs. Happily there are some, but it was hard to find them. Now over time we should be able to solve that as we go at this. So let me get to the fourth problem. How do we know what is successful and not? Schengen and I talked today for an hour in his office, and half of our conversation was about impact evaluation, monitoring, and evaluation. Another one of the failures in our sector and amongst the donor agencies and the governments with which we work is that in very few places have we set up adequate monitoring and evaluation systems. And those that we call adequate very often do not have terribly rigorous evaluations. The quality of the evaluations is poor. So we often don't even have the information base available to identify what exactly works and what doesn't. So this is the fourth one that we have to fix. Now, IFAD is very committed to this. We're as committed to it as we are to scaling up. We're putting money in it. We have a partnership with the World Bank, USAID, Gates Foundation, and IFPRI. And we were talking, Schengen and I, about possibly escalating this to make it even a bigger deal, because it is so important. And he explained, you see, I do listen to you, that actually when you talk about policy, you're talking about evaluation. Because you cannot have good policy unless you know what the impacts are of your previous policy and your existing policy. So I think that we should treat this very much as we have scaling up. It would be worth a new kind of book, actually, on monitoring and evaluation, and not just of projects. Because again, as Shannon points out, very often your project monitoring and evaluation does not actually give you a sufficient amount of information about what would happen if that successful project was scaled up on a larger scale, and the impacts might be quite different. So this is a very complex subject that we have simply done badly. And when I say badly, I mean F, not D. We deserve an F in the international community for this. Now I'm going to stop here. Incentives of staff, denial, monitoring and evaluation, poor policy models in the world, including or particularly from OECD countries in terms of agriculture and rural development. We have our work cut out for us in beating this problem. Thank you very much.